Gurjit Singh, welcome, and you may proceed.
Okay, thank you, Susan. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Gurjit and I like to talk about the research that we do, so we're pleased to be able to do that. And the plan is, as I understand, that I will talk for approximately 50 minutes, and then we'll have a half an hour for discussion, so we can discuss some of the issues that we raised. What Gurjit and I want to do is to talk about auditory-cognitive interactions in speech comprehension. But before I get to that, I just want to mention that this is a real collaborative effort, and I've just listed some of the collaborators that have contributed to the research that I'll be talking about this afternoon. Foremost among those are Kathy Pichora-Fuller, who many of you may know, and also Meredith Danneman. These are the two colleagues that I work most closely with. Okay, so sensory cognitive interactions between hearing and cognition and aging. I'd like to give you some background. I'm a sensory scientist, basically, from a discipline called psychophysics. We study the relationship between the physical stimulus and the sensation that it evokes. That's historically how it came about. And to the sensory scientist, the stimulus is the pattern of energy falling on the sensory organs. So we're interested in the pattern of energy along the cochlear membrane, and we're interested in if we're in vision, we're interested in how the luminance is distributed across the eyes. Okay, to cognitive scientists, the stimulus is quite different. The stimulus is already the word that you hear. It is the pattern. It is a human face. It's a dog barking. It's somebody speaking. So that the starting point of each of these disciplines is quite different. And although both groups recognize that we are dealing with a complex and integrated system of information processing, we tend not to talk to each other. So there are separate conferences that sensory scientists go to. There are separate conferences that cognitive scientists go to. And although we pay lip service to it, we don't really study the interaction that occurs between these levels. So information comes in, it has to be processed by the sensory systems. You have to come up with a representation of what the object is. That object has to be integrated with past knowledge. It has to be, the information about it has to be stored in memory. If you're engaged in a conversation, you have to use the information in formulating a response, etc. So it's a rather complex set of interactions that occur. Now, the lack of communication between sensory and cognitive scientists is not too problematical as long as we're dealing with a uniform population in which there's little variation. So if we're dealing with, say, undergraduate students who have good hearing and good vision, and we want to study cognitive processes, there's no problem, because we can assume that their vision and hearing is good enough so that it is contributing very little to the thing that we're studying, in this case, speech comprehension. But when you come to studying age-related changes and how aging affects this process of speech comprehension, it really becomes necessary to consider the kinds of interactions that occur between the sensory and the cognitive levels. Okay, so without doing that, we're going to not fully understand the process that is occurring in this situation. So what Gurjit and I will be doing is talking about these sensory cognitive interactions. We'll start with hearing, what happens with hearing at the sensory level when we age, and how that affects comprehension. Okay, so now one of the major things that if you have a hearing problem that is going to happen, it's going to reduce your ability to communicate. Now, and what we're going to be arguing is that older adults, by the time you're 65, you have some sort of hearing problems. They may not be clinically significant. You may not need corrective, you may not have to wear a hearing aid necessarily, but your hearing is simply not as good. And that's going to reduce your ability to communicate. And as soon as that happens, as soon as you reduce the ability to communicate, you start affecting the patterns of social interactions you have. So for instance, I cannot function anymore in a noisy restaurant. It's silly for me to go out with a group of people if we're going to a restaurant that's noisy. because I have trouble hearing the person next to me, let alone the person across the table or one that's situated just one person removed from that. So it limits social interaction. And the other thing that it does is it really interferes with your ability to function cognitively. And we'll be going into that more in more detail. If you're not getting the signal in, if you're having trouble, if you're struggling with trying to understand what the words are, that's going to have severe cognitive implications in terms of how well you can perform in a particular situation. Okay, so we're going to start with possible reasons for communication problems in the elderly. Why do we have since I'm elderly, I qualify, why do we have such problems in noisy situations? Why do we have problems in situations in which the younger people in this room would have no problem handling? Okay, so one of the reasons is that there's some peripheral auditory pathology. There are age-related changes in the cochlea, along the basilar membrane, the hair cells, and everything of that sort. So that's going to reduce the quality of the signal that you're receiving along the auditory pathways. There also may be central auditory problems. You have to coordinate the information from the two ears. You have to be able to locate where sound sources are coming from, and you have to be able to focus your attention on a particular sound and ignore others. There are also, which brings up that there are attentional defects, deficits that you could have. So with aging, there's a literature that suggests that it's more difficult to concentrate on a particular voice or a particular subject that you're thinking about. There's generalized slowing. We're not as fast as we used to be. Loss of inhibitory control. It may be difficult to inhibit the processing of irrelevant information, so that if there's multiple conversations going on, it's hard to focus your attention on a single person. It's hard to filter out all of the other information that is being presented to your ears because there are other people talking. There may be language comprehension disorders due to strokes, etc., or many strokes, and short and long-term memory losses. So that there's a whole slew of things that could lead to communication difficulties or to speech comprehension difficulties. Some of these are part of auditory science. Some of these are part of cognitive science. Okay, but what I'm going to argue is that they're really all interrelated, and to fully understand how older adults comprehend speech and how they function in everyday situations, we need to understand how these two systems interact. Okay? Now, this is a very oversimplified conceptual representation of the nervous system. Okay? In the information processing system, you have to take in information from the sensory organs. That's part of the perceptual processing. So you have information that is flowing upward to more central processes. There's a cognitive system that receives this information, but this cognitive system also has some top-down control. There is feedback to the sensory system, and in the case of hearing, it goes all the way to the cochlea itself, that can modify the way in which information is gathered. So even at this level, if you have information coming in, you can also have top-down control that is modifying what sort of information is being gathered, what sort of information is important, etc. So if you have disruption in the upward flow of information, that's going to lead to problems. So you won't be able to have the same kind of clear signal that, say, a younger, good-hearing person has. The signal will be distorted. You may be making mistakes, etc. On the other hand, if you have cognitive level difficulties, part of that may be reflected in an inability to control the perceptual system to the extent that you need to. So that perceptual difficulties could reflect cognitive level problems in organization. If you cannot organize how this information is processed, you're going to have difficulties. And the worst possible case is when you have disruption in both. If you have a poor information coming in simply because the signal has been corrupted, and if you cannot direct the perceptual systems to compensate for that, then you're going to be in really serious trouble. You're going to get poor information coming up, you will not have the compensatory mechanisms operating, and the net result is will be confusion and difficulties in understanding speech. Okay, now, these top-down processes, it's important to understand that they can compensate for auditory processing declines, but there are certain costs involved. And one is a switch over from automatic to controlled processing. For those of you who are as old as I am, if you think back, there was no effort involved in listening when I was younger, in even a fairly noisy situation. Now that I'm older, there's effort. I have to use controlled processing in order to pull out the signal from the background noise. And that increases the demand on resources. Whatever cognitive resources I have, I'm redeploying my attention to the auditory seeing, and that leaves fewer resources for other things such as integrating the incoming information with past knowledge, storing it in memory, and formulating an appropriate response. So if you're older, one of the things that happens if you're having hearing difficulties is that by the time you may be able to process the sentence that you've just heard, but there may be a delay in that processing. So if you are as much as 2 seconds delayed in your understanding, that's well past the time for you to respond appropriately. And it means that during the time at which you're trying to organize and figure out what was being said, the conversation has moved on to a different level, and you've lost that information. Okay, so that's going to lead to a decline in cognitive performance. You will not be able to remember as much as, if you're old, you will not be able to remember as much as a younger person, simply because of all of these processing difficulties. However, there's some encouraging evidence that older adults may be better able to compensate for these perceptual difficulties than younger adults. Okay, now, how do we evaluate these sensory cognitive interactions? Well, one thing that would be nice is if we could find older adults with intact sensory systems that were equivalent to younger adults. You can forget about that. Okay? There may be 1 or 2 older adults out there who have auditory and visual systems that are equivalent to a younger person, but we have failed to find very many. So that if we're looking for older adults with good hearing, our best bet is what we get maybe a third of people that even come close that will report that they have good hearing, and of those there are even a smaller percentage that actually do have reasonably good hearing. Okay, so we can't do that. We can try to simulate the sensory deficits of older adults and younger adults, but that means we have to know what those sensory deficits are, and it's a process that we've tried and we've had some success with, but it is difficult to do. One of the things that we really have concentrated on is to test older and younger adults under equivalent levels of perceptual stress. So this is the handicap way of looking at it. If you make it as hard for the younger adult to hear in a situation as it is for an older adult, then you've compensated for the older adult's problems. Okay? And the easiest way to do that is you just make the noise a little bit higher for the younger adult. So if an older adult needs a fairly high signal-to-noise ratio to hear, what you do is you increase the noise level for the younger adult till they are performing equivalently, and we'll see how that is done. You could try to bypass age-related differences in sensory processing, and we've been doing some of that, and use neural techniques to directly assess brain function. Okay, now what I'm going to do to start off is to just talk about how you can equate perceptual stress for younger and older adults. Make it as hard for that younger adult to hear individual words when there's no contextual support for the words as it is for older adults in the same situation. Okay, so this is a type of test called the speech perception and noise test. There are 2 kinds of sentences that are presented, and it's presented against a background of 12 people talking. So it's a babble is what it's called. And the task is to identify the final word of the sentence. So there are low context sentences, such as Jane was thinking about the football. And there are high context sentences, such as the boy kicked the football. Now, clearly, if you're having trouble processing the auditory signal, if there's context, you're going to be better able to perform with context than without context. The question is, what's the difference between older and younger adults in such situations? So what you do is you simply vary the signal to noise or the signal to babble ratio and map out a function that shows how many words you get correct as a function of how intense the signal to noise ratio is. Okay, and I'll just play a couple of these for you. So this is at a fairly high signal to noise ratio.
Let's decide by tossing a coin.
Okay, let's decide by tossing a coin. There's contextual support. When you decide by tossing, then the natural thing is to say a coin. If we, however, present at a much lower signal to noise ratio.
Miss White won't think about the fact that...
Okay, now Gurjit could probably know that.
No.
No, you can't. Miss White was not thinking about it. Okay, so support instances of this sort and plot out a function. The top panel is it's a single young adult. So there are high context sentences and low context sentences. And you can see that as you increase the signal to noise ratio, performance eventually goes to 100%. And it goes to 100% faster when there's high context than when there's low context. Notice that the older adult requires older adult with good hearing requires a higher signal to noise ratio to get up to that 100%. And that an older adult who's presbycusic, who has poor hearing, in the low context situation, even with extremely high signal to noise ratio, never is functioning at 100%. However, when there's high context, when there's contextual support, that older adult is comparable to a younger adult. So if you're talking about high context information, the older and younger adult will be forming equivalently at a good signal to noise ratio. Now, what I want to focus on is how much benefit each of these get from context, each of these three groups. Okay, so suppose what we do is we find a signal to noise ratio for the low context sentences such that each of these people is getting 20% of the words correct. Okay? So here we have the presbycusic, the older subject and the younger subject. They're all getting 20% correct. But when we look at the signal to noise ratio at which this occurs, it requires a much higher signal to noise ratio for older people than for younger people. And then we can look at that signal to noise ratio where they're getting 20% correct. How much benefit do they get when you add context? And what we see is the younger adult gets very little benefit from adding the context. The older adult gets more benefit, and presbycusics get even more benefit. And so if you're operating at equivalent levels when there's no contextual support, you're getting 20% correct when there's no contextual support. If you're older and you give the context, you do better than the younger. You get a bigger boost. Is that clear? So if we equate for perceptual stress, making it difficult to hear the low context words, then we see that older adults benefit more from context. Okay, and this happens both in audition and vision. This is the percentage correct for low context words, and this is the boost you get. And so you see that if you compare young and old, in both auditory and visual, the old seem to get a bigger boost from context. So they're doing a little bit better, and that's encouraging. It means that they have developed some compensatory behaviors that allow them to recover from situations in which listening is difficult. So in terms of these studies, older adults probably, it's clear in everyday listening situations, older adults are going to have to employ context more often than younger adults. In noisy situations, they have to employ context. They can't hear what's being said. I'll give you an example of how what happened to me at one cocktail party. And I was circulating around, and I thought I heard somebody say, Fourier transforms society. Now, Fourier is a physicist who looked at signal processing, something I'm very interested in. So I thought, oh, that's an interesting concept. How did Fourier transform society? I went over, joined the conversation, and it took me about 3 or 4 minutes until I realized they were talking about Wilfrid Laurier transforming society instead of Fourier. Which brings up another thing, is that as soon as an older adult makes a mistake of this sort, what's the attribution? The attribution is, they're losing it. Okay? They're not as sharp cognitively as they used to be. Schneider used to be pretty good at this stuff, but now he thinks that everything has to do with Fourier, right? And doesn't realize that there's some other aspects to the social, to the human behavior than signal processing. Don't laugh. Okay? So we have that older adults appear to make more effective use of context than younger adults when tested under equal levels of perceptual stress. And the consequence is it's quite likely that listening is more effortful for older adults in everyday situations, even when their hearing is good. Okay, so these are simple sentences. Let's talk about listening to, say, a lecture such as this in a noisy situation. So instead of a quiet room like this, we're in a lecture hall where people are banging tables. There's other conversations. Most of you teach, right? So these days, if you're teaching undergraduates, there are people talking. They're looking at they're examining the internet. They're carrying on conversations, etc., and so on. So let's look to listening to monologues and noise, and what we're going to do is present a story to a group of to a person, and have them listen to it and answer questions after that. So there were two kinds of questions asked: detailed questions and integrative questions. Okay, detailed questions is I'll get to that, but what I'm going to do is just give you an example of what it's like to listen to a story such as this. When the signal-to-noise ratio continues to decrease, that is, the noise gets louder. Okay? It starts out fairly simple.
When you read a Sherlock Holmes story, you're supposed to be amazed at how the great detective notices things others never see. Take that intimate of yourself, your voice. Does it take a Sherlock Holmes to unravel his secrets? No. Apparently it reveals only you think.
Eventually, even if you have good hearing, you're not going to hear it, right? So let's just talk about a baseline experiment. We take younger adults with good hearing and older adults with good hearing. We have them listen to these monologues or these stories under identical conditions, under identical signal-to-noise ratios. So the monologues are presented at the same sound pressure level, and the babble noise when present was the same for all participants. They had to answer detailed questions and integrative questions. Detailed questions are something like, some of the experiments were conducted at one of these universities. This is on a lecture they were listening. This is only mentioned once during the entire 18 minutes, so that's a detailed question. An integrative question is the purpose of this selection was, and then how best to train your voice to show how accurately, and so on. It requires integration of information across the entire lecture. Something that we hope our undergraduates are able to do, and often find that they are not. Okay, and these are the results. So if we look at the number of correct answers on this in this performance, when they're doing it in quiet, we see that both for detailed and integrative questions, older adults do worse than younger adults. They may not do worse on the integrative questions, but we're close to the floor here. That's guessing, so it's hard to tell. But clearly, the older adults are not doing as well as the younger adults. So this is when they're tested under equal conditions. Now what we're going to do is to test them under conditions that are set up so that they're equally stressed perceptually. So we're going to present the signal always 50 dB above the babble threshold, their ability to detect speech sounds. And for each listener, we're going to adjust the signal-to-noise ratio to compensate for their difficulty in hearing individual words and noise. So if I require 4 dB higher signal-to-noise ratio than Gurjit to hear individual words and noise, okay, then when Gurjit is tested, he's going to get 4 dB more noise than I am to compensate for that. Okay? So that is it clear what we're doing? Just going to make it equally difficult. And when we do that, these age differences just disappear for monologues. There's no indication. It looks like there's an indication here, but it's not statistically significant. And in replications, there's no indication that there's any difference. So if we don't correct, if we don't make it equally difficult for young people to hear as old people, the old people do poorer. Okay? And this result also holds for presbycusic listeners. But if we do make it equally difficult, at least with respect to listening to a lecture where there's only one person talking, then older adults are as good as younger adults. Once we compensate for their poor auditory system. Now, we have to qualify this. This is listening to a single lecture. So there's no question who you're supposed to be focusing your attention on. And it's also presented over earphones, so there's no question as to where in auditory space the lecture is coming from, and so on. Okay. Now, so when we do this, everyday situations are not quite like this. Everyday situations, there are multiple sound sources. There's a sound source due to a projector, air conditioning. There are other people talking. There's street noises, etc. And these sound sources are distributed throughout the auditory scene. So it's much more complicated in everyday situations. And if we ask older adults what situations give them the most trouble, these are the ones they say. So they'll say, I can't follow a conversation when there are more than two people talking. Okay? When there's more than one person talking, I have trouble locating the person who is speaking. I sometimes get confused about who said what. Okay? So there's confusion that occurs in these complex auditory scenes when there are multiple sound sources, some of which are other people talking. And I can confirm that I have difficulty in those kinds of scenes. Now, to hear in a multi-talker listening situation, a person has to do a number of things. They have to overcome peripheral masking. All the sound comes together into the ear and it activates the basilar membrane, including the speech signal and all of the other masking sounds. So you have to be able to pull out the signal from the noise at the auditory periphery in order to even get started. You also have to parse the auditory scene into different sources of information. Okay, so if there are several people talking, you cannot confuse the information if you're going to comprehend what's happening. It's a bad thing to confuse the information coming from one person talking with the information coming from another person, or to not know who said what, and we'll get to that a little bit later. You have to focus attention on the target talker, so there's some a cognitive level attentional focus that is required. You have to suppress the processing of irrelevant information. If you're listening to me talking, you have to suppress what other people are saying next to you, and so on. And when appropriate, you must switch talkers' attention from one talker to the other. And so if there's a conversation going on, you have to switch back and forth. Okay. Age-related changes that can make it more difficult for older adults in such situations are cochlear pathology, central auditory declines, and declines in speed of processing, working memory capacity, the ability to inhibit irrelevant information, and to switch attention. If you're slower at switching attention from one talker to the other, you're going to have difficulty in this situation. In other words, any age-related change that interrupts the smooth and rapid functioning of this integrated system of perceptual and cognitive processes that are involved in speech comprehension, anything that disrupts it is going to give you difficulty. Okay, so I just want to take a couple minutes and talk about auditory scene analysis. If we're listening in a complex auditory scene, it is true that certain things will help us. If there's physical separation between talkers, that will help. One of the reasons for that is that if someone is talking over here and there's a noise source over here, the signal-to-noise ratio is pretty good in this ear because of the sound shadow effect. Okay, so you can have, if you turn your ear towards the person who's talking, you can improve the signal-to-noise ratio. Okay, so a consequence of this age-related degeneration is that older adults need a higher signal-to-noise ratio, and that's going to be a general feature of what's happening here. Okay, hence, we expect poorer sound source segregation and older than in younger adults because of age-related changes in the susceptibility to peripheral masking. So if you're having trouble extracting the signal from the background noise at the cochlea, you're going to have a greater deal of difficulty in processing the information and locating the sound sources. Okay, now I want to say a word just about the role of more central auditory processes in this scene analysis. Okay, so in a reverberant environment such as this, your ear receives the direct wave from my mouth, direct sound wave, but it's also receiving reflections of that sound wave off the wall, the table, the ceiling, etc. Now, in order for you not to be confused by these direct waves and the reflections, you have to fuse the reflections with the direct wave. You can do that so long as the delay between the reflective wave and the direct wave is not too long. If it becomes too long, you hear an echo, and that's confusing. And it means that if there are multiple sound sources going simultaneously, say two sound sources, there are two direct waves reaching your ear, and reflections from each of the surfaces for each of these sound sources also reaching your ear a few milliseconds later. You have to be able to fuse the reflective waves with the appropriate sound source in order to do the scene analysis appropriately. Anything that interferes with that is going to cause you difficulty. And what happens is that if you look at the ability of older adults and younger adults to fuse these direct and reflective waves over a longer period of time, that is, when there's more echoes and the echoes persist for a longer period of time, older adults have more difficulty than younger adults. So that means that in any kind of environment such as this, it is going to be somewhat more difficult for the older adult than for the younger adult. Okay? So there's reason to believe that older adults might be less good at scene analysis than younger adults. They may not be able to separate out the different sound sources. And that's reflected in what they say. They don't know who's talking. Okay, they hear somebody talking, they don't know who it is, they can't associate it with a particular person, etc. Okay, now once perceptual segregation is achieved, age-related declines in working memory, speed of processing, inhibitory control, that is, once you have the auditory scene parsed out, you still have these other aspects. You have to switch attention to it. You have to process information coming in from different sources. You may have to inhibit the information coming in from one source so you can concentrate on the other. And so even after you've achieved perceptual segregation, there are factors at the cognitive level that can interfere with it. Okay, so in other words, perceptual segregation could benefit younger adults more than older adults. Okay, so we wanted to test this. So what we did was to test for central effects. That is, once perceptual segregation is achieved, are older adults actually worse than younger adults at benefiting from it? So how do you achieve perceptual segregation without achieve perceptual segregation in such a way that it doesn't differentially penalize older adults? Okay? And I'm going to talk to you about a phenomenon in audition called the precedence effect. If I have a loudspeaker to my left and one to my right, and they play the same sound, but the left one sound comes on 3 milliseconds before the right sound, and so the right sound is always lagging the left sound by 3 milliseconds, I will hear a single sound source. I will fuse those two and locate it to my left. We have to do that because of sound reflections. The first wave takes precedence and it collects the information from the second wave. So I can change the perceived location in this way. Does that make sense? So in this following experiment, and the experiments that we're going to talk about subsequently, the speech signal always came from, was played over both signals. The speech signal was played over both loudspeakers, but the speech signal always came from the right loudspeaker first, and then from the second loudspeaker. So if you're listening at the central location, you hear the speech always on the right. Does that make sense? The speech is 3 milliseconds earlier on the right than on the left. Now the masking stimulus, and there were 2 kinds of maskers, we'll get to that. The masking stimulus was presented in 3 different ways, simultaneously with the speech signal. The masking stimulus could appear, was again played over both speakers, but in one condition, the right led the left by 3 milliseconds, so that the masker was perceived as being on the right, as was the speech. In another condition, the masker stimulus came on simultaneously over both loudspeakers, so the masker was perceived at the center. And finally, in the last one, the masker started first at the left speaker and then followed at the right speaker. And under those conditions, what happened is that you hear the masker on the left. Okay, so there were 3 perceived locations. Now, in all conditions, the masker was presented over both loudspeakers, so the signal-to-noise ratio at each ear didn't change. It was only the timing between the 2 ears that changed. Okay, so is it reasonably clear? So we're changing the perceived location without changing the signal-to-noise ratio at each ear, because the same signals are always there. The only thing is one's delayed by 3 milliseconds relative to the other. And we can ask, what happens? Now, there are 2 kinds of maskers that we used. One was a speech masker, and in this case, the target was a nonsense sentence, and the speech masker was also 2 other people speaking nonsense sentences. The only thing that distinguishes the target starts 1 second after the speech maskers. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to listen to that.
Table might read the mother.
Okay, it's pretty hard. Now this is with the noise masker.
Table might read the mother.
Okay, some of you may have heard that. And this is without any masker.
His table might breathe in the mother.
Okay. So generally what happens if you have 2 other people talking, that's much more deleterious to your following the target talker than if it's noise. And the reason is it's really easier to perceptually segregate the speech target from a masking noise, which is just a random pattern. It's much more difficult when the masker is informationally similar to the target. So if the masker is also speech, it is much more difficult to pull that off. And so people distinguish between what they call energetic masking, and that is the problem at the auditory periphery of pulling the signal out from the noise. Okay, so we know older adults are worse at that, but in this particular case, nothing changed with position. The signal at the signal-to-noise ratio didn't change in the auditory periphery. But it's also true that linguistic and semantic similarity between them and the target could also interfere with identification and recognition of the target speech. And this kind of interference is called informational masking. Okay, so that there are 2 kinds of masking can be going on. All maskers contribute to energetic masking. Okay, so everything is coming into the ear, so you have energetic masking at the ear. But some maskers, for instance, those that are linguistically and semantically similar to the target, are going to be more interfering at a cognitive level. So the question is, once you have achieved perceptual segregation, do older adults benefit as much as younger adults? Okay, from a release from informational masking. Okay, so now one thing we find is that if you separate the 2 sources, so in one condition, both the masker and the target are coming over the are perceived as coming from the same location. That's very difficult. But it's really difficult when the masker is informational. If you now change the perceived location, you get a benefit. Okay? It's much easier to hear if the perceived location changes, even though nothing has changed in terms of the signal-to-noise ratio of the ear. Come on. Okay, oops. Okay, so what sort of predictions can we make? Assuming that energetic masking remains constant, anything that increases the distinctiveness of the target and maskers will reduce the degree of informational masking. Changing the perceived location will also do that, and hence separating the perceived location from the target from the maskers should provide more of a release from informational than from energetic masking. And that's essentially what happens. I'll just go through this. In the upper diagram, you have results for young people, and when the masker was noise, and when the noise was coming from the same location as the target, you can see that they do okay. You need a certain signal-to-noise ratio to hear. But when you change the perceived location of the masker to a different location, then there's a benefit. You do better, okay, when there's noise. So there's no question that changing the perceived location works. But it does the same for younger adults, for older adults as younger adults. These functions are identical, except that older adults need a higher signal-to-noise ratio in both conditions. When the masker is informational, that is two other people talking, so it's speech. When, for young people, when it's the same, you're doing fairly poorly. It's hard to pull out the target when they're both coming from the same perceived location. Notice, however, that when they're perceived to be coming from different locations, you get a huge benefit. Okay, so as soon as you can perceive that the target is spatially separated, you get a big benefit from that. On the other hand, the older adults get the same benefit. Okay, so that once they got it seems that once older adults have the perceptual separation, they do as well as younger adults, which is pretty impressive. Okay? So the only difference that we found between younger and older adults is that older adults need a higher signal-to-noise ratio than do younger adults in every condition. But the amount of benefit they get from a change in spatial position is the same for younger and older adults. Okay? Now, there are other factors that are likely to affect perceptual segregation, and one of them I'm going to talk about is simply a top-down factor, such as knowledge or content of the content or location of a target. Okay, so if you know what the content of the conversation is, it's much easier to follow it. If you know where the target talker is, it turns out that it's much easier to follow it. And I'll give you some examples of this. Okay, so in this case, both the target and the masker are presented over the same loudspeaker, so there's no spatial separation. But what happens here is that, again, there are two types of maskers, noise and two-talker speech. But what we're going to do is we have a nonsense sentence. And what we're going to do is, in some conditions, we'll present you the first 4 words of the nonsense sentence, but not the last one. We'll give you advanced knowledge. And then we'll present that same sentence in noise and see what benefit you get from knowing what the first 4 words are. Now, the first 4 words don't allow you to identify what the last word is going to be. Okay, so will prior knowledge lead to a greater reduction? So this is what it sounds like with the last word blacked out.
A shop can frame it.
Okay, this is a nonsense sentence. You have no idea what it's going to be. And the real sentence is when it's presented in noise.
A shop can frame a dog.
Okay, a shop could frame a dog. So these are presented in the 2 kinds of noises, and the question is, and they're presented to half of the subjects without this prior sentence. Okay?
A shop can frame it.
And then to the other half of the subjects, they just get the full sentence in the noise. But the first subjects get it first, and then followed by the full sentence in the noise. Okay? So what you find in this instance is that when you present the sentence without the prompt, okay, this is the function you get. This is for young. When you give the prompt in noise, it does improve performance. Not a lot, but it does improve it. But the improvement is the same for older adults. If the masker is speech, if you get an improvement, again, when you give the prompt, when you give them information about what the first 4 words are going to be. But again, there is really no difference between young and old in this situation. So again, the old seem to benefit fairly well from that. Okay, so I'm running a little bit behind time. I have to talk to you about this one because it's part of Gurjit's thesis.
I don't know if I have to.
No, you'd hit me if I didn't.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's prior knowledge of content. What about prior knowledge of location? And will location, if you know where the speech signal is in a complex listening environment, will that help? And indeed it does. The question here, will it help older adults as much as younger adults? Okay. So the stimuli in this case were something called the CRM corpus. It was something, the sentences were like, ready Charlie, go to green 7 now. And so notice that there is a call word, Charlie. This could be ready Charlie, ready Victor, ready Baron, go to, and then there are different colors and numbers. Okay, so what you can do is present 3 different sentences of this type from 3 different perceived locations, one to the left, one to the center, and one to the right. Okay, all simultaneously. And you can do, with respect to identifying the call sign, you can say ahead of time, okay, the call sign is Charlie. So you have to pull out the sentence, ready Charlie, go to green 7 now, and you have to say green 7 to be correct. Okay. Now, you can make the location at which this sentence is going to be presented certain. It's always going to be from this location. Or you can make it uncertain. Okay, so you can change the certainty. And you could also change whether or not you tell the person the call sign before the sentences are presented or after. Now this is really hard. I refuse to be in this experiment. Because if it's after and it's an uncertain location, think of what you have to do. You have to keep all of this information in memory, essentially, till you hear the call sign from all 3 locations, because you have no idea which location is the correct one. Does that make sense? It's not an easy task. I'm surprised anybody was able to do it. As I said, I didn't want to do this. Okay, so again, this is just one aspect of Gurjit's work. This is where you change the perceived location using the precedence effect. Okay, so you have all 3 sentences going simultaneously. One appears to be from the left because the left loudspeaker reads the right. One appears from the center because they both come on at the same time. And one appears from the right because the right leads the left. Okay? And these are the 2 factors. So there were different degrees of uncertainty. In the certain condition, all of the targets were at the center. And in the 4 other conditions, the probability of the target being at the center changed from 80 to 60 to 33%. Okay? 33%, there's no information at all. Okay, so these are the results for the young and old. So as certainty of location goes up, when you know the location, you do fairly well. Also note that if you get the call sign after, you do poorer than if you get the call sign before. Okay, and so you've got a nice function here, but the function is virtually identical for the young as it is for the old, except the old require a higher signal-to-noise ratio. The only difference. So again, the old are doing fairly well as long as you compensate for this signal, the fact that their hearing is a little poorer in this situation. This is actually somewhat surprising to me because I actually thought that they would not be able to do this as well. I think it surprised you as well.
It did, but I think one of the powerful messages of this slide is that if a person knows where a signal is coming from, so if we refer to those where the location certainty is 1.0, older adults are getting almost perfect intelligibility, even in this complex environment. So that speaks to having that older adult know where that target signal is coming from. So in a conversation, getting that older adult's attention first before you talk can result in an improvement from, you can see it gets down to about 30 to 40% if a signal comes out of nowhere, if it's unknown where that target is coming from. But once they know where it is, they're almost perfect at identifying speech. So how do you tell that older adult, hey, I'm over here, without it being, so obtrusive to the conversation? The first thing you do, just talk to them. Say their name. So Ben or Jill. And once they know where they are, then conversation can improve.
So, conclusion, prior knowledge of target location helps, and equally, younger and older adults, presenting the call sign before rather than after has a greater facilitative effect just what Gurjit said, I won't repeat it. There's a main effect of age, but that's likely due to energetic masking. Older adults just need, if we presented the target at a slightly higher signal level than the two maskers, we would wipe out that age effect. Okay, so I'd like to draw just a brief conclusion, and then I'm going to have to rush through something so that I can get, we have some time for discussion. In general, if you talk about age-related changes in the sensory system, it's going to put older adults at a disadvantage than younger adults when performing cognitive tasks such as speech comprehension. There's no question. Testing younger and older adults under equivalent levels of perceptual stress eliminates age differences in comprehension of memory for monologues when the auditory scene is simple. Again, I emphasize it's a simple scene. You know where the target location is, it's right at your ear. And you don't have to switch attention from one thing to the other. And under those conditions, testing under equal levels of perceptual stress works. Now, I can't read this. Okay, now, an interesting thing that happens is, suppose you do something like this, but you remove all contextual support. So essentially, you're asked to memorize individual words in case paired associates. You adjust it so that each older and younger adult finds it equally difficult to hear individual words. And then you test them in a memory, how much they remember. Older adults don't remember as much as younger adults. And so we're not saying that there aren't age-related changes in cognition, because even when we adjust in this listening situation, we give them. And so that memory is not as good, even after adjusting for equal perceptual stress. Now that suggests that if the older adults are doing so well in monologues, then they must be employing some sort of compensatory strategies that are effective enough that they can boost their performance to levels of younger adults. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is also true with speeding. If we speed speech, monologues, and or sentences in such a way that we don't distort them in a way that is hard for older adults to hear, then testing under equivalent levels of perceptual stress, we can double the speech rate and not interfere with perception. Older adults will suffer as much as younger adults by the same amount. Okay? Younger and older adults benefit equally from prior knowledge, and perceived spatial separation provides the same degree. And these are relatively simple scenes, simple sentences. Are younger and older adults better at compensating for perceptual problems? Well, the Pichora-Fuller study with the spin sentences suggests they can use context better. There's also some evidence that older adults may benefit more from repetition than do younger adults. I'm not going to go into those studies. I'm just going to skip that for now. Okay? And simply specify that if you have repetition of information, now one of the things that older adults often do, or one of the things that correct, is could you repeat that? Or they'll give you some sort of signal or gesture that they're not understanding, and the expectation is there will be a repetition. It appears that older adults can make better use of repeated information, repeated graded information even, than younger adults. They can use that more effectively. I just want to end up by saying what happens to speech comprehension when the auditory scene and cognitive demands of the listening situation become more complex. Okay, so rather than simple sentences or monologues, what we're going to do is present dialogues. And we'll present them in noise in a complex auditory scene. Okay, so we could ask, for instance, is spatial separation going to be as effective in younger and older adults when the task requires listeners to comprehend and remember details from a dialogue? I'll give you an example of a dialogue.
Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was a week ago. Father? Father, are you there?
What? Yes, my son, go ahead.
Now these,
I mean, I've really sinned.
Go on, I'm listening.
It's too terrible. I'd better warn you.
Nothing is too terrible for the ears of our Lord. You go right ahead.
I mean, really terrible.
Don't be worried, my son. I hear terrible things every day. Nature of the priesthood, you know.
You'll be shocked.
My boy, I'll listen with the patience of Job. Now, please, get on with it.
Oh, God, I can't even say it.
It's all right, my boy. Spit it out.
I've killed someone.
I see. Killed someone? Killed someone?
Yes.
Goodness gracious, that is something.
So, you see, Father, I'm a murderer.
Well, what do you know about that? How did you do it? I mean, how did it happen?
It was one of those moments. I just lost control. I can't explain why.
Yes, only...
I'm going to cut it off. But if you're listening in a situation like this, and there are two people talking, there are two sources of information, they have two different points of view, if you start confusing one with the other, so at some point in this case, it's going to be, someone's going to say, was there any blood? So a question could be, who first mentioned blood? If you haven't separated out the two talkers, and you don't know whether it was the penitent or the priest who was saying that, there's going to be difficulty. So you have to switch attention from one location to the other. If there's a spatial location involved, so it's not just from one talker to the other, but you have to switch from one spatial location to the other. Okay, so we can in all of these situations we present either everything from the same loudspeaker or from two different loudspeakers, with the babble always coming from the central loudspeaker. In each case we adjust so and it's equally difficult for younger and older to hear the individual words. We make that adjustment if there's no contextual support. And then if we look at what happens, notice that when there's zero separation, and younger and older adults are affected by noise in the same way. So if the babble increases, the performance drops, but it drops by the same amount. So if there's no spatial separation, they are essentially equivalent. But as soon as you put spatial separation in, the younger adults benefit much more than the older adults from it. It's as if they can make use of this cue. So if there's spatial separation between the two talkers, then in terms of the percentage of information that the younger adults can recall, they do much better than the older adults. Okay, so when the scene gets complex, you start to see these age differences appear. And I am going to, call it quits at this so that we can have some time for discussion. Just a take-home message, in general, age-related changes at sensory systems of older adults place them at a disadvantage relative to younger adults. Older adults have to make more use of compensatory strategies in order to compensate for these deficiencies, and that means that they will have less resources available for other aspects of speech comprehension. The more complex the auditory scene, the more likely we will find age differences in speech comprehension. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I think it's probably time to turn it over to questions concerning this. Yes.
I didn't hear you say what the range was for the older adults, what the age range was that you got.
Older adults are all
older
over.
Adults are,
yeah, they were all over 65. The average age in these experiments is about 72.
Yeah.
About 72. So they're the younger end of older adults.
yeah.
They're all high-functioning older adults. They have to come into the lab And in addition, they have to pass a screening test for auditory functioning. So they're good hearing older adults, although their hearing is not as good as younger people.
No, I just wondered how old you?
Yeah. Well, the age range that we have people are in 80s and 90s, but not that many, of course.
But I think you raise kind of an interesting question in that the studies that are primarily done at our lab focus on healthy older adults, free of stroke, free of dementia, free of Alzheimer's. And we see that all that has to be done quite often is just a slight raise of this signal relative to the noise. So if you make the listening situation a little bit easier for older adults, you see some of the cognitive differences go away. But then that sort of begs the question, what about older adults that do have dementia or do have Alzheimer's? And just like research in every field, less research is focused on older adults, and even further less on people that have dementia or Alzheimer's. But there was some interesting...
You might even have older adults who are much older and not have stroke or deficit, significant deficits, but normal, so-called healthy.
The old as
older ones.
Absolutely.
And you might have a incremental issue.
What's interesting, and one of the questions that I asked myself is, well, how do these results extend to people with Alzheimer's or dementia? And there isn't a lot of research out there, but there was an interesting paper by Palmer written a few years ago that looked at people with Alzheimer's disease, and they did an assessment of how much Alzheimer's does she have on this rating scale. And this was before an auditory intervention. And then half the individuals were provided with a hearing aid. And for the group that was not provided a hearing aid, they further declined on performance on this measure, as well as on the measure by their caregiver. So how many problem behaviors did this person exhibit? How many confusions were there? But what's interesting is for that group that was provided a hearing aid, the rate of Alzheimer's magically did not continue to diminish. And so it was just a matter of compensating for some of the auditory difficulties. And there was a reduction both on the score on this Alzheimer's measure, but also by the caregiver. So the caregiver noticed that there weren't as many problem behaviors, that there weren't as many confusions. So I think that's an interesting demonstration, not from our lab, but from another lab that looks at the issue of auditory compensation for people with that aren't in the healthy population.
It also argues that people in the healthy population should be given auditory compensation when they need it, because otherwise they are going to be having more and more difficulty communicating, and the effect on social interaction, I think, can be quite significant. And it doesn't make sense for me to go to a party where there are a lot of young people and there's background music and it's noisy, because I might as well just sit in the corner and drink, because I can't hear anybody. I can't hear what's going on. Not that it's that bad to sit in the corner and drink, but it looks odd.
Good case for making sure that we overcome the social stigma of wearing hearing aids. Now they're getting smaller and more invisible. More people seem to be wearing them. And some of the work with patients who are getting older, if they don't hear very well, they become more paranoid. The behavioral question that Mr. Singh was pointing out becomes more acute. So there are significant issues related to your problem. So thank you very much. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave.
You raise an interesting point. There is a tremendous issue with paranoia resulting from not having that auditory signal. But the attribution quite often is that, oh, that person didn't hear me. The attribution is they've lost it. Old man Schneider has lost it.
I get as old as I am. Sorry. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions? I wanted to ask about the testing procedure prior to the experiment, so that you know what the decibel level is for in order to equate or sort of level the playing field between the older and younger adults?
What we do is we give them the SPIN test with low context sentences. And then we look at the signal to noise ratio at which they can detect 50%, that they get 50% correct. Okay, so for me, my signal to noise ratio that is required for 50% correct detection in those is going to be about 2 to 3 dB higher than it would be for Gurjit. So he gets 2 or 3 more dB noise when we test in these other situations. That's basically how we do it. And that seems to work quite well.
In your experience, do you see any difference in gender? Is there anything towards that?
From the clinical end of the spectrum, certainly there are more males that come in to the clinic with noise-induced hearing loss, and that's primarily related to working in the industry. So that's a very clear gender difference that we see in the literature.
But with respect, we haven't looked for gender differences in performance. Usually we have 12 to 20 subjects in an experiment, of which 2/3 are women, typically. So we have a 1/3 male population. It doesn't give us a great deal of confidence in any generalization we may make from that.
Well, we would like to thank you very much for coming to speak today. And as a small token of our appreciation, we have our own little...
Thanks, Susie.